I used to believe that love was proven by trust, and trust meant letting someone into every quiet corner of your life. That was before Daniel Brooks taught me how fragile belief can be. My name is Emily Carter, and for most of my adult life, I lived carefully. I worked long hours at a mid-sized marketing firm, rented a modest apartment, and saved every spare dollar with the discipline of someone who had learned early that security was never guaranteed. I wasn't bitter about it. I took pride in my independence. I liked knowing that if everything else fell apart, I could still stand on my own. Daniel came into my life when I wasn't looking for anyone. We met through mutual friends at a small dinner gathering, the kind where conversation flows easily and no one feels the need to perform. He wasn't loud or flashy. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did talk, his words carried warmth and intention. He asked questions that made me feel seen rather than examined. By the end of the evening, I noticed how naturally he fit into the room, as if he had always been there. Our relationship grew with a comforting steadiness. Daniel remembered details about my day, checked in when work overwhelmed me, and never mocked my cautious nature. Where I hesitated, he reassured. Where I doubted myself, he encouraged. He spoke often about the future, not in grand promises but in gentle certainties. A shared home, a small business someday, a life built slowly and honestly. What drew me in most was how safe he made me feel. I had dated men who thrived on drama and unpredictability, mistaking intensity for passion. Daniel was different. He was calm, consistent, and patient. When he held my hand, it felt less like a spark and more like an anchor. Over time, my guarded instincts softened. I invited him into my routines, my private habits, my financial goals. I told him about the savings account I had built over years, money meant for emergencies, for a down payment, for the future I imagined. He never asked to control it. He simply listened, nodding with admiration, telling me how responsible I was, how rare it was to meet someone who thought ahead. That admiration felt validating. It made me proud. It made me trust him more. Daniel began spending more time in my apartment. He cooked dinner, fixed small things I'd been ignoring, and talked about merging our lives in practical ways. When he suggested that we should start planning together instead of separately, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt logical. He spoke of partnership as a shared responsibility, not a sacrifice. The first time finances entered our conversations more seriously, it was framed as teamwork. He mentioned potential investments, smarter ways to grow savings, ideas he had researched late at night. He never rushed me. He never demanded access. He simply positioned himself beside me, as if we were already standing on the same side of every decision. That I noticed small changes in him as months passed. Occasional late nights he blamed on work. Moments when he seemed distracted, his phone lighting up and then disappearing into his pocket. When I asked, he smiled easily and brushed it off. Stress, deadlines, nothing worth worrying about. I believed him, partly because I wanted to, and partly because nothing concrete contradicted his explanations. Trust has a quiet way of rewriting doubt. Eventually, I gave Daniel limited access to help manage future planning. It felt like a symbolic step, one that confirmed we were building something real. He thanked me with sincerity, promising transparency and care. I remember thinking that love wasn't just about romance anymore. It was about shared responsibility, about choosing someone every day. Around others, Daniel was attentive and charming. Friends praised how lucky I was. My family relaxed around him, sensing stability in his presence. Each approval layered over my own confidence, reinforcing the belief that I had chosen wisely. Yet sometimes, in rare, unguarded moments, I sensed a distance I couldn't explain. His affection never disappeared, but it occasionally felt rehearsed, as if he were fulfilling a role rather than responding instinctively. When I reached for reassurance, he provided it smoothly, so convincingly that I questioned my own intuition instead. That I told myself that no relationship was perfect, that my past caution was resurfacing unnecessarily, that love required faith. The night before everything began to unravel, we sat together on my couch, discussing plans for the coming year. Daniel spoke with certainty outlining steps we would take, milestones we would reach. His confidence was infectious. I leaned into him, listening, imagining a life that felt stable and earned that as he talked. His phone buzzed softly on the table. He flipped it face down without a glance and continued speaking, his voice steady, his smile practiced. I noticed the gesture, fleeting but deliberate, and felt a brief flicker of unease. I ignored it. I rested my head on his shoulder, believing that whatever future awaited me, I was facing it with the right person. I didn't know then that the foundation beneath that certainty had already begun to crack, quietly and invisibly, preparing to give way. The first sign that something was wrong arrived without drama, slipping into my life like an accounting error rather than a catastrophe. One quiet morning, while reviewing my monthly expenses, I noticed that my savings balance looked smaller than it should have. At first, I assumed I had misremembered the figure. Numbers can blur after long work days, and I had always trusted my routines more than my memory. That I checked again that evening, scrolling carefully through the transaction history. A transfer stood out, modest enough to seem harmless but unfamiliar all the same. I told myself there must be a reasonable explanation. Daniel Brooks handled some planning details now, and perhaps I had simply forgotten approving it. When I asked him about it, Daniel didn't hesitate. He explained that he had moved a small amount temporarily to take advantage of a short-term opportunity, something he had mentioned before. His tone was relaxed, his expression open. He kissed my forehead and thanked me for trusting him. I felt faintly embarrassed for questioning him at all, but trust, once disturbed, rarely settles completely. Over the next few weeks, I began checking my account more often. Each time, I told myself it was just to stay organized. Each time, I noticed another transfer, another withdrawal that didn't match anything we had discussed. The amounts varied, never large enough on their own to trigger panic, yet collectively unsettling. When I asked Daniel again, his patience thinned just slightly, enough for me to feel it. "You're worrying too much," he said one night, his smile tight. I thought we agreed this was a shared plan. The word shared landed heavily. I apologized, though the unease lingered that Daniel's behavior shifted in subtle ways. He became more protective of his phone, stepping out of the room to take calls, angling the screen away when messages arrived. His late nights grew more frequent, his explanations shorter. When I suggested we spend a weekend together without distractions, he claimed work deadlines that couldn't be postponed. That I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love didn't require constant verification. Still, the silence between us began to stretch point one afternoon. While Daniel showered in my apartment, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I had never looked at his messages before, not out of virtue, but because I had never felt the need. That day, the screen lit up with a notification that froze me in place. A woman's name I didn't recognize, Lena Whitmore, followed by a heart emoji that I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. The moment imprinted itself sharply, burning through every excuse I had built. That night, after Daniel left for another late meeting, I sat alone at my kitchen table, replaying the months we had spent together. I searched for moments I had overlooked, words I had softened, instincts I had silenced. The realization wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly, painfully, like a truth demanding to be acknowledged. The next discovery came by accident. While organizing paperwork, I found a receipt tucked inside a folder Daniel had used. It was for an expensive restaurant I had never been to with him, dated on a night he claimed to be working late. The total was far beyond what we normally spent. A pattern began to emerge, ugly and undeniable. I started paying attention in ways I never had before. Designer shopping bags appeared in the trunk of his car, brushed off as gifts for clients. Unfamiliar cologne lingered on his jacket. When I asked direct questions, Daniel responded with irritation instead of reassurance. "You don't trust me anymore," he accused one evening, turning my concern into a flawed. I wondered when caution had become betrayal in his eyes. Unable to ignore the growing evidence, I logged into my savings account late one night and examined every transaction carefully. The transfers weren't random. They followed a rhythm, timed around Daniel's absences. The money wasn't being invested. It was being spent. My chest tightened as I traced the amounts back months, realizing how much had disappeared. This wasn't carelessness. It was intentional. The emotional betrayal hurt, but the financial one cut deeper. That money represented years of discipline, sacrifices, and self-denial. It wasn't just savings. It was my sense of safety. I confronted Daniel the following morning, placing printed statements on the table between us. I asked him calmly to explain every withdrawal, every unexplained expense. For the first time since I had known him, he didn't meet my eyes. He laughed lightly, as if the evidence were an inconvenience rather than an accusation. He claimed misunderstandings, blamed poor communication, suggested I was overreacting. When I pressed further, his charm evaporated, replaced by sharp defensiveness. "You're making this into something it's not," he said. "You're paranoid." That word landed like a verdict. In that moment, I understood that honesty would never come willingly. The truth had to be taken, not given. Later that day, while Daniel was out, I gathered every document I could find. Receipts, bank records, messages he had left open on shared devices. Lena Whitmore was no longer an abstract suspicion. She existed in photographs, reservations, purchases funded by my trust. As I sat there, surrounded by proof, the weight of reality settled fully on my shoulders. The man I had planned a future with had built another life using my money and my faith. That I didn't cry right away. I felt something colder, sharper, clarity. By the time Daniel returned that evening, I had already made a decision. I wouldn't beg for explanations or apologies. I wouldn't argue over excuses. I looked at him and realized that the love I thought we shared had been quietly replaced by calculation. That I said nothing that night. I simply watched him move through my apartment as if nothing had changed, unaware that the story he controlled was about to end. The decision to act didn't arrive with anger or theatrics. It arrived quietly, like resolve settling into place. Once I understood the scale of Daniel Brooks's deception, emotion gave way to precision. I stopped asking questions that would only invite lies. Instead, I focused on facts. The following days became exercises in discipline. I documented every unauthorized transfer, every receipt tied to expenses that had nothing to do with our shared future. I organized timelines, cross-referenced dates, and highlighted patterns that even denial couldn't disguise. The work was exhausting, but steadied me. Each detail I gathered restored a fragment of control Daniel had taken from me. When I met with the financial advisor recommended by my firm, I spoke plainly. There was no embellishment, no attempt to soften the truth. As she reviewed the records, her expression shifted from neutrality to concern. She confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't mismanagement. It was embezzlement. That word lingered long after the meeting ended. From there, everything moved with methodical inevitability. I contacted the authorities, handing over copies of documents I had spent nights assembling. Detective Alan Foster was assigned to the case, a man whose calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos Daniel had introduced into my life. He asked clear questions, never assuming, never minimizing. For the first time since the truth surfaced, I felt believed without needing to justify myself. Daniel sensed the shift before he understood it. He became unusually attentive, cooking dinner unprompted, suggesting weekend trips, speaking again of the future, as if repetition could restore reality. His affection felt strategic now, his words carefully chosen. I listened without responding, observing how easily performance replaced sincerity. When Detective Foster requested additional information, I complied promptly. Bank statements revealed how Daniel had routed my savings through accounts I didn't recognize. Surveillance footage from restaurants and boutiques confirmed purchases made during his supposed work nights. The evidence accumulated steadily, stripping away any remaining ambiguity. Lena Whitmore appeared in the investigation not as a mystery, but as a beneficiary. Her name surfaced alongside luxury charges and reservations that traced directly back to my account. When contacted, she distanced herself immediately, offering limited cooperation and no loyalty to the man who had funded her indulgences. The disappearance of her presence from Daniel's life was swift and unsurprising. Daniel was confronted by authorities one morning while I was at work. I learned of it through a brief call from Detective Foster, his voice measured and factual. Daniel had attempted to explain, to minimize, to reframe the narrative as a misunderstanding between partners. The records contradicted him at every turn that I wasn't present when he was taken in, and I was grateful for that. I didn't need the image to validate my decision. The knowledge that truth had finally outrun manipulation was enough. The days that followed were marked by formalities. Statements, signatures, meetings that required me to recount events with consistency and clarity. Each retelling stripped the story of emotion, reducing it to actions and consequences. It was painful in a different way, less sharp but more enduring. When the case moved forward, Daniel's demeanor changed. He contacted me through his attorney, requesting leniency, invoking shared memories, attempting to resurrect intimacy as leverage. I declined to respond. Whatever we had once been no longer existed. What remained was accountability. Standing in the courtroom weeks later, I felt the weight of finality. Daniel avoided my gaze, his confidence eroded, his charm useless against documented truth. When asked to testify, I spoke steadily, neither vindictive nor apologetic. I described facts, not feelings. The judge listened, unmoved by theatrics, attentive to evidence. The verdict was delivered without drama. Guilty, Daniel Brooks was sentenced for financial fraud and embezzlement. The words echoed softly, not as triumph, but as closure. Justice didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance restored. Walking out of the courthouse, I expected relief to overwhelm me. Instead, I felt a profound stillness. The chapter that had consumed my thoughts for months was finished, but the story of who I was becoming remained unwritten. My savings would take time to rebuild. Trust would take longer. Yet as I stepped into the afternoon light, free from secrecy and manipulation, I realized something essential had survived intact. My sense of self that I had not been foolish for loving. I had been brave enough to confront betrayal without losing integrity. That understanding followed me home, settling in quietly, preparing me for the life I would now rebuild on my own terms. And for the first time since Daniel entered my world, the future felt honest again, unfamiliar, uncertain, but undeniably mine. Life after the trial did not transform overnight. There was no sudden happiness, no dramatic reinvention. Instead, recovery unfolded quietly, shaped by small, deliberate choices that gradually returned weight to my days. I learned to live without the constant vigilance that had defined the final months with Daniel Brooks. And in that absence, I began to hear my own thoughts again that I moved to a smaller apartment closer to work, not out of necessity, but intention. I wanted a space untainted by memories, a place where nothing belonged to anyone else. Each box I unpacked felt like a declaration of ownership over my future. I rebuilt routines with care, rediscovering comfort and predictability rather than control. Reclaiming my finances was a slow process. I worked closely with advisors, rebuilding my savings methodically, refusing shortcuts. The discipline that once made me vulnerable now became a source of strength. Every deposit, however modest, reinforced the truth that security built by my own hands could not be taken lightly again. Emotionally, healing required patience I had never practiced before. I attended therapy not to relive betrayal, but to understand it. I examined the boundaries I had blurred in the name of love, the instincts I had overridden for harmony. The process was uncomfortable, but it was honest. I wasn't interested in becoming harder, only wiser. Marcus Reed remained a steady presence through it all. We had worked together for years, exchanging professional respect and occasional humor. But our connection deepened in the aftermath of the trial. He never asked invasive questions or offered hollow reassurances. He simply listened, responding when invited and staying silent when that was what I needed. Our conversations unfolded slowly, unburdened by expectation. Marcus spoke about his own missteps, his belief that character revealed itself most clearly in quiet moments. I found comfort in his consistency, in the way he showed up without insisting on significance. There was no urgency, no performance, no need to impress. For a long time, I resisted labeling whatever was growing between us. I had learned the cost of rushing meaning into affection. Instead, I observed how I felt in his presence, calm, unguarded, unafraid. When doubts surfaced, they were met with conversation rather than avoidance. That alone felt revolutionary, that I no longer mistook attention for devotion or promises for proof. Love, I realized, was less about intensity and more about alignment. It was choosing someone who respected your autonomy as much as your vulnerability. One evening, months after the trial, Marcus and I shared dinner at a modest cafe. There were no grand declarations, only an understanding that had been building quietly. When he reached across the table and asked, gently, whether I was ready to move forward, I didn't answer immediately. I listened inward, searching for the familiar tension that used to accompany decisions like this. That it wasn't there. What I felt instead was clarity. I told him the truth, that I was still learning, still cautious, still healing. He accepted that without hesitation, offering presence rather than assurance. In that moment, I understood how different real love felt. It didn't demand certainty. It made space for it. As time passed, my life settled into a rhythm defined by intention rather than reaction. Daniel Brooks became a distant chapter, his absence no longer heavy with resentment. I didn't forgive him in any formal sense, but I released the need to carry his choices with me. Accountability had been served, and that was enough. Looking back, I see now that betrayal did not end my story. It redirected it. The loss forced me to confront what I deserved and what I was willing to protect. I learned that starting anew wasn't about erasing the past, but integrating it without letting it dictate the future. There are still days when memory intrudes unexpectedly, but they no longer derail me. They remind me of resilience, of boundaries earned through experience. They remind me that survival can be quiet and powerful at once. Standing in my new apartment one evening, sunlight spilling across the floor, I felt a sense of completion that surprised me. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. I had chosen myself without bitterness, opened my heart without surrendering my strength, and redefined love on my own terms. The story I once thought was about betrayal had become something else entirely, a testament to accountability, growth, and the courage to begin again.